So this week going into Sunday, into our sacred gathering, we're apparently halfway through Lent already. I had never run into this, but apparently this Sunday is called Latter Sunday or Latar. It means like the Rose Sunday. The word actually means rejoice, but it's kind of like that joy candle that we get midway through Advent. But it's a weekend in which we're supposed to actually stop fasting. We're supposed to take a break from things and remember that the whole purpose of Lent and its kind of more morose trappings are meant to focus us and help us realize that there's actually a deep joy in the midst of that. And so I looked and saw one of the traditional readings for this Sunday. It's actually one of my favorite Old Testament stories. It's an excellent story. I think for what's happening on this Later, or however you're supposed to say it, Sunday, because it's a very kind of playful, fun story. It's a favorite of children's Bibles and places like that for a reason. It's a great story of when David is anointed over his brothers, but at the same time, the context of this story is actually pretty serious. A major fallout, the loss of the old king's status, this falling out between his mentor, the prophet Samuel. So yeah, before I talk about it too much more, I just wanted to note it's just a really interesting kind of mix of this kind of beautiful, humorous in a lot of ways story in the midst of kind of a difficult context. It feels like a good rejoicing Sunday in the midst of Lent, in the midst of a pretty dark world at times. So let me read this story. I am at the beginning of 1 Samuel in chapter 16, reading verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long are you going to grieve over Saul? I've rejected him as king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and get going. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, because I have found my next king among his sons." "How can I do that?" Samuel asked. "When Saul hears of it, he'll kill me." "Take a heifer with you," the Lord replied, "and say, 'I've come to make a sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice. I will make clear to you what you should do. You will anoint for me the person I point out to you." Samuel did what the Lord instructed. When he came to Bethlehem, the city elders came to meet him, and they were shaking with fear. "Do you come in peace?" they asked. "Yes," Samuel answered. "I've come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Now make yourselves holy. Then come with me to the sacrifice." Samuel made Jesse and his sons holy and invited them to the sacrifice as well. When they arrived, Samuel looked at Eliab and thought, "That must be the Lord's anointed right in front of me." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Have no regard for his appearance or his stature, because I haven't selected him. God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans only see what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart." Next, Jesse called for Abinadab, who presented himself to Samuel, but he said, "The Lord hasn't chosen this one either." So Jesse presented Shammah, but Samuel said, "No, the Lord hasn't chosen this one." Jesse presented 7 of his sons to Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord hasn't picked any of these." Then Samuel asked Jesse, "Is this all your boys?" "There's still the youngest one," Jesse asked, "but he's out keeping the sheep." "Send for him," Samuel told Jesse, "because we can't proceed until he gets here." So Jesse sent and brought him in. He was reddish-brown, had beautiful eyes, and was good-looking. And the Lord said, "That's the one. Go anoint him." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him right there in front of his brothers. The Lord's Spirit came over David from that point forward. Then Samuel left and went to Ramah. So I love this story because it's just, it's such a good exemplar of this biblical theme of God reversing things, right? The old king, Saul, was famous for being kind of kingly, right? He's an unusually tall guy, as mentioned several times. He's big, he's handsome, he's kingly, right? He's what you're expecting. Based on the fact that they're always talking about his height, we could almost assume that he seems like a giant, this person that you would look up to. And of course, the next chapter right after the one I read is going to be David slaying Goliath. And so it's kind of a humorous way of saying this man who was considered a giant, a real king, everything you're expecting, doesn't look so big and tough and like a giant when he meets the real kind, right? And yet we get this contrast with this boy who isn't even considered a real son in a lot of ways, right? He's out tending the sheep, and there's no possible way that this could be the one that God is seeking for a king. And I love this translation had it a little differently, but the very literal translation is, "And the Lord told Samuel, I've found a king among Jesse's sons." I love that phrase because it's just like God's looking around. It almost feels like he's like picking up rocks looking for bugs or something. Man, there's got to be a king around here somewhere. And there's one. I found me a king over here. It's the last son. It's the youngest. It's the one that is basically just keeping with shepherds, which again, an image that the Bible loves playing with. The image in the ancient Near East a lot of the time was kings were talked about as shepherds. But the abstract idea of a shepherd and shepherding people is a lot nicer than an actual shepherd who probably smells a little bit and spends all his time out in the wilderness and is almost easily forgotten. When he says, "Show me your sons," he forgets he has this other son, right? He's got tons of them. He's the last one that you're going to expect to be the king, the one that God chooses. And yet this kind of constant reversal of God picking the surprising, the least. It shows up a ton in the Old Testament. It's going to show up even more so in the New Testament. And I think one of the key verses in this section is that one when, Samuel's clearly thinking on the same terms he used before. Okay, we're looking for the big guy, the big handsome one, the kingly guy. And then in verse 7, the Lord says to Samuel, "Have no regard for his appearance or his stature. I haven't selected him. God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans only see what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart." This is such a key verse, I think, for understanding so much about what God is doing in the world, especially maybe nowadays in a world in which it's hard to tell what's actually true, right? It's getting harder and harder with the amount of deception going on with companies, with leaders, with the people we even work with at times, that we're all kind of vying, for an advantage. We're kind of curating our appearance on Facebook and other social media. We're trying to look a certain way and sometimes maybe even convince ourselves we're a certain way. And yet God is cutting through all that, going to the very center. He says, "Look, I see your heart." And David is later going to be given this beautiful nickname of a man after God's own heart. And so one of the questions I wanted us to wrestle with, what does that actually mean? David's not a particularly moral guy, right? We're going to meet him. He makes a lot of mistakes, a lot of really horrific mistakes. He's not really that much of a king you'd want to look up to. He's not much of a dad. He's not much of a friend. He's not even particularly religious. Saul got in trouble for taking on some kind of priestly duties, right? That were kind of beyond his job description. David kind of does the same thing at points. So what is it about this man that God sees in him and says, yeah, this man is a man after my own heart and is going to have a big impact on this story? And so that's one of the questions I want us to be kind of wrestling with. But I also want us to note in this story, it says right at the end, before David's done anything, that the Holy Spirit is going to rest on David. This, in the Old Testament particularly, is almost always a sign not just that God is with him, he's going to be able to do incredible things, but also that a spiritual revival, that God is doing something new, is showing up. This shows up around Moses. This is going to show up around some of the judges, and it shows up around David. And again, it's interesting that David is going to have a pretty big impact on the story of the Bible overall, right? He's going to build the temple. That's going to be a major center point for God's story. David is going to get this promise of kingliness, and that a king is ultimately going to come from him. Although it's going to be a shockingly different king than everyone expecting, one that looks more like him as the shepherd, as the least, as the small, than it is this kind of vision of grandeur that he's going to be kind of pretending to live into the rest of his ministry. And I was just thinking about this story and the way God chooses some things and kind of rejects other things. The ways David's actual impact through the Spirit is largely in the religious realm, largely in kind of subverting what it is he thinks he's being called into. And I was reminded of this story from an anecdote that I think is from James Cone, the theologian. But he talks about this was his favorite story in the Old Testament growing up, because when he was growing up, his mom led the Sunday school class. And the way she told this story was, just kind of an expressive telling. When she's expanding it, she starts out with each of the older brothers. What is it? We got Eliab and Abinadab or whatever. And she would describe to the class what these guys would look like. They're big, strong, and handsome. And she'd make it more modern. And by the way, he was the quarterback for the local team. And then the next brother comes in. But then he says, we only have a couple of them actually named, right? There's these other brothers that aren't named, and the way she would tell this story is she would include the people that are generally thought of impressive in their little town growing up, right? Maybe she includes this telling, and then the third brother came, and he was, Frank. Frank was the mayor, of course, of their town at the time. Or maybe it's so-and-so. Everyone knows he's the most successful local business person, right? She would tell this story in a way that tied in all the things in the world we're supposed to be impressed with, all the people that she thought would be easy to be impressed with or mistake for greatness and success. And again, not saying that they're necessarily bad people, but in the end, the theme is the Lord doesn't look at those things. He looks at the heart, and he sees in this small, in this least, his future king. I've found a king. I love just kind of the playfulness of this story, that even David has no idea what his significance is going to be, but God sees his heart. In the one of the children's Bibles that the kids are going to be reading on Sunday, it says, "I found a heart that looks a lot like mine." And so I think that's the invitation, is maybe can we tell the story the way this mother told it, right? Noticing the big and the impressive around us and going, that's not how God thinks. God thinks a certain way. He likes a heart to look a certain way. Can we be inspired by that? Can we use that to maybe laugh in the face of some of the darkness in the world and ponder, what is it going to take for our hearts to look more like David's, our hearts to look more like God's heart, so that even if we aren't that impressive, even if we are the least and easy to overlook and forget about because we're out in the fields doing the real work, God will notice us. God will inspire us and teach us to be like his shepherd king, like his son.